The soft, amber glow of the setting sun illuminated the crystal champagne flute in Kennedy Bentley's hand, casting prism-like reflections across the mahogany bar of the Havenbrook Grand Hotel. 10 years since graduation, and here he was, a self-made millionaire returning to a place that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. He adjusted his custom-tailored jacket, wondering why he'd let his assistant talk him into attending this reunion when he could be finalizing his newest hotel acquisition in Dubai. "Is this seat taken?" a melodic voice asked from behind. Kennedy turned, the practiced smile he reserved for business associates already forming on his lips, but it froze halfway when he recognized those hazel eyes. Time seemed to suspend as he stared at Paige Reynolds, the woman who had once been the center of his universe during those 4 transformative years at Westlake University. "Paige," he managed, her name feeling both strange and comfortable on his tongue. "Please sit." She slid onto the bar stool beside him, her emerald dress catching the light as elegantly as her smile caught his attention. She looked different, more confident, with an air of accomplished grace, yet those eyes remained unchanged, still reflecting the intelligence and warmth that had first drawn him to her in their freshman economics class. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, signaling the bartender. "Last I heard, you were too busy building your hotel empire to bother with old college memories." Kennedy chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "My assistant insisted it would be good for my public image, though I suspect she just wanted me out of the office for a weekend." Paige laughed, the sound bringing back a flood of memories: late-night study sessions, spring picnics by the lake, the way she'd rest her head on his shoulder during movie nights. They'd been inseparable until senior year, when differing career ambitions and the pressures of post-graduation plans had slowly pulled them apart. "So," she said, accepting a glass of wine from the bartender, "Kennedy Bentley, hospitality magnate, I've seen your face in Fortune. Quite the success story." "It still feels surreal sometimes," he admitted, something about her presence making him more candid than he'd been with anyone in years. "What about you? Last time we spoke, you were heading to graduate school for marine biology." Her eyes lit up. "I'm a conservation director now, primarily focused on coral reef rehabilitation. My team just secured a major grant to expand our work in the Pacific." Kennedy found himself genuinely impressed. While he'd been building luxury hotels, Paige had been saving ecosystems. It was so perfectly her, the same passionate idealist he'd fallen for years ago, now with the credentials and experience to make real change. "I'd love to hear more about it," he said sincerely. The evening melted away as they reacquainted themselves, exchanging stories of the past decade. Kennedy described how he'd started with a small boutique hotel in Austin that he'd renovated himself, slowly building a portfolio of unique properties that emphasized local culture and sustainable luxury. Paige told him about her research expeditions, the challenges of securing funding for conservation efforts, and the small victories that made it all worthwhile. By the time the reunion's welcome cocktail hour officially began in the adjacent ballroom, they'd barely noticed the arrival of their other classmates. "Should we join the others?" Paige asked, though her tone suggested she was as reluctant as he felt to break the bubble they'd created. Kennedy hesitated. "Actually, there's a small restaurant down the street that I remember having amazing food. Would you want to continue our conversation there instead?" Her smile was answer enough. 20 minutes later, they were seated in a cozy corner of Bella Not, the Italian restaurant that had been a special occasion spot during their college years. Over handmade pasta and a bottle of Barolo, they delved deeper into their lives, filling in the gaps that social media updates could never capture. "You never married?" Kennedy asked, trying to sound casual despite his genuine curiosity. Paige twirled pasta around her fork. "Almost once. James was a fellow researcher. We were together for 3 years, but ultimately our priorities didn't align. He wanted to settle down in his hometown, and I couldn't give up field work." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "What about you? No Mrs. Bentley to help run the empire?" Kennedy shook his head. I dated seriously a couple of times, but he paused, searching for the right words. When you're in my position, it becomes difficult to know if someone is interested in you or your bank account. Understanding softened her features. That must be lonely. It was lonelier than he typically allowed himself to acknowledge. His life looked perfect on paper. Financial success beyond what he'd dreamed possible, properties in desirable locations around the world, respect within his industry. Yet returning here, sitting across from Paige, he was acutely aware of what his life lacked. "What happened to us, Paige?" The question escaped before he could reconsider it. She set down her fork, her expression thoughtful. "Life happened. You were focused on your business degree and your entrepreneurial plans. I was consumed with research and grad school applications. We both wanted different futures in different places." "And now?" Kennedy asked, surprising himself with his boldness. "Now," she said, a small smile playing at her lips, "we're just two old friends catching up at a reunion." But as their eyes held across the table, they both knew it felt like something more. The weekend continued with what Kennedy could only describe as a rediscovery. They spent Saturday morning browsing the farmers' market that had been a staple of their college Saturdays, laughing as they recognized vendors who had somehow not aged a day in 10 years. Paige insisted they visit their old academic buildings, and Kennedy found himself recounting stories he'd forgotten the time he'd fallen asleep in the library the night before finals, the heated debate in business ethics that had nearly gotten him kicked out of class. That afternoon, while most of their classmates attended the formal reunion events, they drove to Crescent Lake, where they'd spent countless weekend afternoons during warmer months. The October air had a crisp edge to it now, but the scenery was as beautiful as ever, maple and oak trees ablaze with autumn colors. "Remember when you tried to teach me to skip stones?" Paige asked, picking up a smooth, flat rock from the shore. Kennedy grinned. "You were hopeless." "No coordination whatsoever," she feigned offense. "I'll have you know I've improved greatly." With a flick of her wrist, she sent the stone skipping across the lake's surface 1, 2, 3, 4 times before it sank. "Impressive," Kennedy conceded, selecting his own stone. His skipped 6 times, disappearing into the distance. Paige bumped his shoulder playfully. "Still showing off, I see." They walked along the shoreline, reminiscing about study groups and mutual friends, filling each other in on the lives they'd built since graduation. Kennedy found himself talking about aspects of his success. He rarely discussed the sleepless nights worrying about payroll in the early days, the mentor who'd believed in him enough to invest in his second property, the satisfaction of creating jobs and watching employees grow within his company. "You've built something meaningful," Paige said as they sat on a weathered dock, feet dangling above the water. "It's more than just luxury hotels. You're creating experiences for people, memories they'll cherish." Her understanding struck a chord. Most people saw only the wealth he'd accumulated, not the vision behind it or the work it represented. "What about your work?" he asked. "Tell me more about these coral reefs you're saving." Her face animated with passion as she explained the delicate ecosystems she worked to protect, the innovative techniques her team was developing, the race against time as climate change threatened these underwater worlds. Kennedy watched her speak, mesmerized by her enthusiasm and expertise. "I'm hoping to secure funding for a new research station in Indonesia," she concluded. "The area has incredible biodiversity, but it's under threat from both climate factors and local fishing practices. With the right resources, we could establish protected zones and work with communities to develop sustainable alternatives." An idea began to form in Kennedy's mind, but he set it aside for later consideration. Tonight was the formal reunion dinner, and despite his initial reluctance to attend, he now found himself looking forward to it primarily because Paige would be there. When he picked her up at her hotel room that evening, the sight of her in a floor-length navy gown momentarily rendered him speechless. Her hair was swept up elegantly, revealing the graceful curve of her neck, and the simple diamond pendant at her throat drew attention to her collarbones. "You look beautiful," he said finally, meaning it more than any compliment he'd given in years. A hint of color touched her cheeks. "You clean up pretty well yourself, Mr. Millionaire." The ballroom was transformed for the evening, with twinkling lights and tables adorned with centerpieces in their university colors. As they entered, Kennedy was acutely aware of the curious glances cast their way. He was used to attention. His success had made him something of a celebrity among their graduating class, but tonight felt different with Paige by his side. They were seated with 6 other classmates, including Todd Mitchell, who had played basketball with Kennedy, and his wife Lauren, who had been Paige's roommate junior year. The conversation flowed easily, filled with updates on careers and families, nostalgic stories, and good-natured teasing. "I always knew you two would find your way back to each other," Lauren commented after dinner when they'd moved to the dance floor. "You were perfect together." Kennedy exchanged a glance with Paige, who looked as surprised as he felt by the declaration. They hadn't discussed what was happening between them, this reconnection that felt both new and familiar. "We're just catching up," Paige said lightly, but Kennedy noticed she didn't pull away when he placed his hand on the small of her back. Later, as they swayed to a slow song, bodies closer than strictly necessary, Kennedy found himself thinking about paths not taken. What if they'd tried harder to make it work 10 years ago? What if distance and ambition hadn't seemed like such insurmountable obstacles? "What are you thinking about?" Paige asked, looking up at him with those perceptive eyes. "Second chances," he answered honestly, "and how sometimes the timing needs to be right." The evening ended too quickly, and soon they were standing outside Paige's hotel room, that familiar end-of-date awkwardness hanging between them despite their history. "I had a wonderful time," she said, her key card held loosely in her hand. Kennedy nodded, suddenly feeling like a college freshman again rather than a successful businessman. "Would you have breakfast with me tomorrow, before you head back to—" He realized he didn't even know where she was based now. "San Diego," she supplied. "And yes, I'd like that." He leaned forward, intending to kiss her cheek, but Paige turned her head slightly at the last moment. Their lips met in a gentle, questioning kiss that quickly deepened as years of unacknowledged feelings rushed to the surface. It was both familiar and new, like returning to a favorite place and discovering it was even better than remembered. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Paige's eyes were wide with wonder. "That was long overdue," Kennedy finished for her, his heart racing in a way no business deal had ever caused. She laughed softly. "Yes, exactly, but we should probably talk before," she gestured between them, "before we skip ahead 10 years, he suggested with a smile. "Agreed, breakfast, 9 a.m. "It's a date," she confirmed, the word date hanging significantly between them. Kennedy walked back to his own room feeling lighter than he had in years, as if some tightly wounded part of himself had finally begun to unravel. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he thought about the business empire he'd built, the success he'd achieved, and realized that none of it had made him feel as alive as these 2 days with Paige. The next morning, over coffee and pastries at a local cafe, they faced the reality of their situation. Paige's life was in San Diego, where her research organization was headquartered. Kennedy's business operations were primarily based in Chicago, with frequent travel to his properties around the world. "So where does that leave us?" Paige asked, stirring her latte absently. "A nice reunion weekend and back to our separate lives," Kennedy considered her question carefully. 10 years ago, geographical distance and different aspirations had seemed like valid reasons to end things. Now, with the perspective of time and experience, he wondered if they'd given up too easily. "What if I told you I've been considering expanding the conservation initiatives at my properties?" He said, "My resort in Bali already partners with a local marine protection group, but I've been thinking about a more comprehensive approach across all locations." Her eyes lit up with interest. "That could make a real impact, especially if you implemented it across your portfolio." "It would need expert guidance," he continued. "Someone who understands both the science and how to communicate its importance to guests." Understanding dawned on her face. Kennedy, are you offering me a job? He shook his head. Not exactly. I'm suggesting a collaboration between your organization and my company. A partnership that would benefit both our missions while giving us a legitimate reason to see where this might go. He gestured between them. No pressure, no grand promises, just an opportunity to explore possibilities. Paige set down her spoon, studying his face. You're serious about this? The conservation aspect makes complete business sense, he assured her. Sustainable tourism is the future of the industry, but yes, I'm also serious about wanting to see you again regularly, intentionally. A slow smile spread across her face. I'd need to discuss it with my board, of course, and we'd have to establish clear professional boundaries. Absolutely, he agreed. Total transparency, and we take things slowly, she added. Getting reacquainted in the present rather than relying on who we were in the past. Kennedy nodded, hope rising in his chest. I can fly to San Diego next week to meet with your team, start laying the groundwork. You move quickly when you want something, don't you? She observed with a teasing smile. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Some opportunities are worth pursuing immediately. True to his word, Kennedy flew to San Diego the following week. The meetings with Paige's conservation organization were productive, with both sides recognizing the potential benefits of collaboration. More importantly, the evenings they spent together walking along the beach at sunset, trying local restaurants, talking late into the night about everything, and nothing confirmed what the reunion weekend had started. The connection between them was real and worth exploring. Over the next 6 months, they developed both a professional relationship and a personal one. Kennedy's hotels began implementing more robust conservation programs, from eliminating single-use plastics to offering guests opportunities to participate in local environmental initiatives. Paige's organization gained valuable corporate support and access to new locations for their research. Meanwhile, they navigated the challenges of a long-distance relationship with frequent video calls and visits whenever their schedules aligned. Kennedy found himself rearranging business trips to include San Diego when possible. Paige occasionally joined him at his properties to oversee new conservation projects, extending her stays for personal time together. In April, Kennedy invited Paige to join him in the Maldives, where he was considering acquiring a struggling resort. The property had potential, but needed significant renovations and a completely new operational approach. What do you think? He asked as they toured the overwater bungalows, which had once been luxurious, but now showed signs of neglect. Paige surveyed the crystal-clear waters surrounding them. The location is incredible, and the reef system here is actually quite healthy compared to others in the region. With the right protection measures, it could thrive. So you'd recommend moving forward? She turned to him, eyebrow raised. Since when does the great Kennedy Bentley need my business advice? He smiled, pulling her closer. Since I realized that having you in my life makes everything better, including my business decisions. That night, after a dinner served on the beach under the stars, Kennedy surprised Paige with a proposal, but not the kind she might have expected. I've been thinking about establishing a permanent research facility here, he said, unrolling architectural plans on the table. A dedicated marine conservation center that would operate in conjunction with the resort but remain independently funded and scientifically directed. Paige's eyes widened as she examined the detailed drawings. Kennedy, this is extraordinary, the labs, the equipment, this is state-of-the-art. It would need a director, he continued casually. Someone with extensive experience in coral reef ecosystems and a passion for conservation education. She looked up sharply. Are you offering me a job again? I'm offering you an opportunity, he clarified. To lead something unprecedented in the region while basing yourself at what I hope will become my flagship property for sustainable luxury. And where would you be in this scenario? She asked carefully. Kennedy took her hands in his. I've been considering relocating my primary residence. Chicago winters are overrated, and with remote work capabilities, I can manage most operations from anywhere. I was thinking somewhere with better diving opportunities, perhaps. Understanding dawned on her face. You want us to live here together. I want to stop measuring our relationship in flight hours and time zones, he said honestly. I want to build something lasting with you, Paige, both professionally and personally, but only if that aligns with what you want too. She was quiet for a long moment, and Kennedy felt his heart beating heavily in his chest. Had he miscalculated, moved too quickly? I've been offered a position at the Scripps Institution, she said finally. Director of their new climate resilience initiative. It would be a significant career advancement. Kennedy nodded, trying to mask his disappointment. That's an incredible opportunity. You should take it. I haven't given them my answer yet, she continued, squeezing his hands, because something told me to wait until after this trip. Hope flickered in his chest. And now I'm looking at an opportunity to create something from the ground up, something that could become a model for resort conservation partnerships worldwide. Her eyes shone in the candlelight. Something I could build alongside the man I've fallen in love with again, or maybe still, I'm not sure which. Does it matter which? Kennedy asked, his voice rough with emotion. She smiled, reaching up to touch his face. I suppose not. What matters is that I love you now, and I want to build this future with you. Kennedy pulled her close, overwhelmed by the certainty that this woman, this moment, this second chance was worth more than all the hotels and millions he'd accumulated. 1 year later, the Bentley Maldives Resort and Marine Conservation Center celebrated its grand opening. The renovated property had been transformed into a showcase of sustainable luxury, with solar power, water reclamation systems, and a zero-waste initiative that was already being studied by other resorts in the region. The Conservation Center, under Paige's direction, had quickly established itself as a leader in coral restoration techniques, with visiting researchers from around the world and educational programs for guests that were consistently overbooked. To new beginnings, Kennedy proposed a toast during the private celebration dinner after the official events concluded. Around the table sat their closest friends and family who had traveled from around the world to share in their success. And to old foundations, Paige added, her eyes meeting his with the warmth and understanding that had only deepened over their time together. Later that night, on the deck of their overwater bungalow, Kennedy knelt before Paige with a small velvet box containing a ring, not a flashy diamond that spoke of his wealth, but a band of recycled platinum set with a pearl harvested through sustainable practices. 10 years ago, we let circumstances pull us apart, he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I don't want to waste another decade. Marry me, Paige, be my partner in all things. Tears glistened in her eyes as she nodded. Yes, 1,000 times yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Kennedy marveled at how differently his life had turned out from what he'd planned. He'd attended that reunion reluctantly, expecting nothing more than networking opportunities and perhaps some nostalgic reminiscing. Instead, he'd found his way back to the woman who challenged him, inspired him, and loved him not for his success, but for the person he was beneath the millionaire facade. They married 6 months later in an intimate ceremony on the beach at sunset, witnessed by their closest friends and family. Their vows spoke of second chances and timing, of building meaningful lives both individually and together. 2 years into their marriage, as Kennedy watched Paige explaining coral formations to a group of fascinated resort guests, their 3-month-old daughter Lily sleeping peacefully against his chest in a baby carrier, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. His success had given him financial security and professional satisfaction, but reconnecting with Paige had given him purpose and joy in a way he hadn't known was missing. Together, they were creating something greater than either could have accomplished alone, a model for how luxury tourism and conservation could not only coexist but thrive in partnership. You're looking contemplative, Paige observed, joining him after her presentation concluded. Just counting my blessings, he replied, slipping his free arm around her waist. The resort is exceeding projections, your conservation work is getting international recognition, and we have this little miracle. He nodded toward their sleeping daughter. Paige leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder in a gesture so familiar it made his heart ache with contentment. Who would have thought a reluctant reunion attendee and a marine biologist would end up here? I certainly didn't expect it, Kennedy admitted. But I'm infinitely grateful that I went to that reunion. Me too, Paige whispered, reaching up to kiss him softly. Me too. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks that reflected on the tranquil water surrounding them, Kennedy Bentley, millionaire, conservationist, husband, and now father, understood with perfect clarity that true wealth had little to do with the fortune he'd amassed. It was measured instead by the love he'd found when he least expected it, with a woman who had once been his past and was now, gloriously, his future.